Hello, Rod Fleming in the Philippines here. Now, we want to continue the civilization thing because, okay, it doesn't have many viewers, but hopefully that'll build up. So let's have a look at the next one. Before I do that though, I want to revisit an earlier video in this series in which we discussed dentition. The differences in dentition between Australopithecus afarensis and Australopithecus africanus. I know it sounds real recherche, but essentially, afarensis had quite prominent lateral incisors, that's canine teeth, and africanus didn't. They had teeth very similar to modern human teeth. And we said, look, you know, that's quite important. It kind of makes you look at africanus as, you know, the point at which you can begin the human story. I didn't mention, I should have, that one of the reasons why animals like dogs and cats and all these other animals have big lateral incisors, and they have several functions. One, of course, is to grab and to rip meat, you know, for killing prey, but it's also for carrying things. You throw a ball for your dog and it will pick it up in such a way that the ball's actually held behind the canine teeth, and cats do the same thing. If they pick up their babies, their young, they'll use these teeth to do so. So these are really important in the business of, you know, carrying things around, which essentially is important for everyone, whether you have to carry food, drag it up your tree like a leopard does, whatever. These canines act like big hooks, you know, that allow you to really, allow the animal to really get it upstairs, you know, really get some power behind hauling it, which is kind of difficult with flat teeth like humans have because this stuff slips out, as you possibly know. Steven Pinker, in a book, I can't remember the name of the book, Steve, sorry, but I read it at the time, made the point that he thought that there was a relationship between standing up and carrying tools, and I think that's probably true. It's also worth pointing out, however, that if you're carrying your tools in your hands, you don't need the teeth, all right? That's an interesting one because it means that there's another thing going on there with africanus, which suggests that not only was africanus walking around, he's carrying things in his hands. And because he was carrying things in his hands, he didn't need these big teeth. So they basically just evolved out of existence because they were redundant. And they get in the way. You know, if you watch a dog chewing on a piece of meat or something like that, it does it with the side of its mouth because the canines get in the way. And of course, you know, that's awkward. So humans quite possibly lost the big teeth just because we were carrying stuff about. So, you know, apologies to Steven Pinker, I did actually forget about that, but there you go, it's in now. So the next thing I want to talk about, because we've talked about all this, about cooking, sitting down at the end of the day and, you know, eating together, which is something that humans have always done. You know, we've got plenty now of examples of eating sites, you know, places where people have stopped and eaten, and it's clear that this was a communal activity. They were also talking. We know they were talking because, as we've discussed before, this is something that humans do. We have the dropped larynx and we have a hyoid bone, which gives us a really tremendous range of vocalization, much more than most other animals, you know. So we were using these. They didn't just, you know, happen. They evolved because they had a function, and the function was speech. Speech needs to be based in language. How do you evolve language? Well, it starts with real simple stuff. And you can learn this just by watching how children learn language. It starts with real simple stuff, you know, mummy, daddy, I want this, I want that, probably not even so much, you know, sore tummy, that sort of thing. But it very quickly gets to telling stories. And humans tell stories to their children. The reason they tell stories to their children is to help them learn the language. And we've been doing that since we first evolved. Storytelling is a huge part of being human. It's really important. In fact, we can honestly say that human culture isn't really culture at all without the speech element, without the talking element. It's not really what we would, I mean, how could you have human culture without people talking to each other? It's just, it really doesn't work. You can't really conceive of this because that's how we get ideas between each other. So you have to assume, and it is reasonable to assume, that very early on in our history, we started telling stories. Now, we do have support for this, because there are still cultures, there are still Neolithic cultures on the planet today, right? An awful lot of them got rubbed out in the 18th and 19th centuries, but there still are some, and many of the ones which were rubbed out more recently, we have very good details about. You know, we know a lot about them. Telling stories is a way to develop identity, right? What we do is we tell stories about who we are and what we are and how we got here, and that defines identity. And we still do that. People who are toddling around talking about identitarian politics, most of it is to do with culture. It's not to do with skin color or, you know, whether you're 6 foot or 5'4" or anything like that. It's just, you know, what your culture is. That's the spoken culture. And a very good example of this comes from First Australians. First Australian culture obviously was still completely intact until about 300 years ago, and it just untouched. And there are still many extant First Australian cultures, and they came to a very low ebb, but they are still there. And we know from anthropological studies of First Australian, sometimes called Aboriginal, but First Australian cultures, that they have an immensely sophisticated culture. They don't write things down. Westerners always assume that if a culture is non-literate, then it's got problems, it's not up to snuff. This is complete nonsense. This is just nonsense, you know. Cultures that don't write things down are just as sophisticated as writing cultures. It's just they do things in a different way. For example, the Celts. The Celts never wrote anything down at all. It was all knowledge was held in amongst a group of people, very highly trained individuals called the Druids, and they did a 23-year period of it. Sorry, 19-year period of education, equivalent to doing a master's, by the way. At the end of which they were qualified Druids, and they had learned by rote all of the knowledge of their people. And the same happens in the First Australians today. It happens right now. They're doing it now. And there's an extremely good book, right, by a guy called, unfortunately late, dead guy. He wasn't dead at the time, like, called Bruce Chatwin, who unfortunately succumbed to complications from HIV, I guess about 25 years ago. The book is called The Songlines, and it's a lovely book. It's really worth reading. It's a damn good book. And Chatwin was an extremely good journalist, you know, absolutely was a complete star, and a great novelist too. So he took the things that he found out, you know, while wandering through the First Australian areas of Australia, and created a book out of it, which is what you do, you know. Anyway, he talks about the songlines. Now, I don't know if you've heard about the songlines, but I'll briefly encapsulate what they are. In these cultures, and they appear to be very widespread in Australia, each tribe has an ancestor animal, right? Or sometimes a bird, sometimes a fish. So basically you'll have the wallaby people, or the kangaroo people, or the red kangaroo people, the grey kangaroo people. You'll have the eagle people. You'll have loads and loads and loads of different people. That's their original ancestor, right? The ancient ones. And what happened was that the ancestors were half man, half beast. And again, this is something you'll encounter many, many times. All over many different cultures, you'll find this half man, half beast thing. It's really important. It's a central cultural theme. So what was happening was that these who were men, the women have a completely different culture in native Australian cultures. And Westerners didn't even realise this until about 10 years ago, and suddenly went, wait a minute, there's a different women's culture, but they keep it secret. And at the moment, we really don't know what it is. We know that they do revere a mother goddess, but we don't know any details. It's very, very secret. What we know about the songlines is pretty sketchy too. The First Australians are extremely careful about who they let know, inform of their culture. Anyway, to go back to the men's side, the first animals, the ancestor animals, walked through the land and they sang it into existence, right? So they would say, I'll have a mountain over there and I'll have a river here and across there we'll have some trees. And they would walk through the land singing this, right? It's quite important, this. And then this song would be handed down for generations upon generations of men, right? Not women. Women aren't allowed to know this stuff. They got their own. So what would happen is that, supposing there was a big flood and the river changed its course and, created a couple of oxbow lakes, which I'm sure you remember from your geography lessons before they stopped teaching geography, that would be added into the song. And how did that happen? Because people would walk the song line, right? They'd walk through the country singing the song, and then they go, oh wait, look, there's an oxbow lake there, that's not in the song. I'll add in a line, right? Making it clear that this has changed, right? And then at a gathering, a ceremonial gathering called a corroboree, which again, Westerners really don't know much about, but we do know that this happens. These modifications to the song lines are incorporated into the official version of the song, and everybody learns that. So now there's a song, there's an oxbow lake there, and so the song line changes in response to changes in the landscape in a way that a written document couldn't possibly. Because we live in a technological age and digital age, we've become used to documents being updated without having to be republished. Thank you very much, APA. But until very recently, that just wasn't the case. Oral traditions were far more flexible. They could respond to major changes instantaneously. Whereas the written stuff, you could be looking at a book that's 20 years old, and I'm sure you've all done this. You looked at a book and you look at the cover and go, damn, this thing's 20-year-old, so it's out of date. It doesn't cover what we're looking at now. So, there are quite a few things that are important about the way that oral traditions work. So anyway, you have this thing where the song lines, and each tribe knows all the song lines in its particular tribal area, and some of the ones outside as well. There's a lot of crossover. Sorry, it's kind of hot in here. And so this is all learned, and it can all change, right? And it's a crisscrossing network that goes all over Australia. And so a man could walk from, the Northern Territories right down, right down to the south, following songlines and not get lost. And this ability totally flummoxed the Western when Westerners arrived, because we're a written culture, and we have maps. We go, oh, yeah, that's a map. And we would show our maps to the first Australians, and they go, what's that? Goes, what's that thing? And the Westerners assumed that the first Australians couldn't understand the maps because they were somehow primitive. And they went, oh my God, that's terrible. Fancy not being able to read a map. What they didn't realise was that Aboriginals didn't need a map. They had it in their heads already. It's all there in songlines, which actually, if you think about it a little minute, it's very similar to the way that computer code is written, right? So it's really sophisticated, this. If you navigate a computer game, it's all in lines of code. And that's essentially what the songlines are. They're a program which tell you exactly where you are at any given time, just by, you go into the program, oh, I'm here. That's it, it's done. Don't need a map. Why would I need a map? It's absolutely brilliant. I love it. When I first read about this, I was like, wow, that is deep. And it gets more so, because at least one major First Australian language group, there are several, and this is the one that gives us words like kangaroo, by the way, so it's really a big one. They don't have position indicators that are relative to the speaker, or to the person he's speaking to, or to anything else. So they don't have a word for in front of, or behind. They don't have a word for to the right of, or to the left of. They don't have words like that at all. They don't exist in their language. They have cardinal indications. So everything is to the north of, to the south of, to the west of, or to the east of, either the person speaking or the person being spoken to. Everything. They don't have any other kind of indicators. So when you take that understanding of position, right, which basically means everybody's got a compass in their head. They don't need to carry a compass. All they need to know is, where did the sun rise? Right? So you've got a compass in your head and a map in your head. You can walk straight across Australia and straight back, never get lost. And Westerners couldn't, they called it walkabout. It wasn't really walkabout, it was actually more like a pilgrimage. It's still happening, it's still more like a pilgrimage in which the men walk the lines, you know, to make sure that they're kept up to date, that they're maintained. And that's culture, right? And then they come back and they have these corroborees where everybody gets, you know, loads of food and dancing and all the rest of it. And they incorporate these, they exchange their new lines, and these become the new songlines. And that's culture. That's how culture develops. Now, the first Australian system is similar to many others, right? You know, a lot of these have been lost, but we find similar things in North America, South America, and in other parts of the world. The cardinal positioning thing is very unusual. It's the only place I know of it happening was Australia. But the idea of the ancestor animals, or ancestor beings, talking the world into existence, right, is really common and really old. That's why in the Bible it says, in the beginning there was the Word. Right? That's why it's there. That's what it means. I'm telling you. I'm using words. I'm telling you. So talking shouldn't just be seen as, you know, a way of, oh, you know, let's go and hunt some antelope, you know, that sort of thing. I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do with it. But it provides you immediately with an incredibly, the potential for extremely deep cultural understandings. And these exist without being written down. I mean, that's the important part. All over the world, there are these traditions which were never written down. And Westerners don't understand them because everything for Western has to be written down, right? The Celts, they believed, the Druids believed that written language, written history was a poor history because you hadn't learned it. You know, you hadn't learned that. You don't really know it. It's in a book. You're going to open the book and read it. You don't know the history. Whereas they would say, I do know the history because I've learned it all. Every single line of it, I know. And so, you know, this is a real interesting thing. Oral culture comes from this business of people sitting round, you know, their fire and talking. And, you know, they would say, you know, the great eagle man created such and such a place and da-da-da-da-da. And that's where your creation myths come from. The idea of communicating with other people. And mythology exists. Mythology is a kind of roadmap. That's a good way of expressing it. It's a kind of roadmap of human development. Unfortunately, and it's really unfortunate, we only know those parts of culture that were written down. And that started very recently. You know, very, very recently, only about 6,500 years ago, maybe 7, in the Fertile Crescent in what is now the Middle East, Iraq, people started to actually write things down. There's some isolated examples before that might possibly have been writing, maybe going back to about 10,000 BC, but that would be 12,000 years ago, obviously. But, for example, words that might possibly have been indicative of concept like God, but there's nothing written. There's nothing with grammar and syntax, right? There's nothing stories. There are no stories. Whereas you come to Mesopotamia 6,500 years ago, 7,000 years ago, and you're actually seeing real stories. You're seeing, you know, plot, context, grammar, syntax, all of this sort of thing. It's much more than just, you know, one or two words. It's a really developed culture. Now that didn't come from nothing. That didn't just spring out of midair. What happened was people were writing down in that era, and continue to do so today, they were writing down stories that already existed, right? So, to quickly recap, we now have a situation where, we've lost our fangs because we're carrying stuff around. We're eating cooked meats. We're walking on two legs and carrying our tools around. And we're talking to each other. And more than that, we're explaining the world around us to each other using language, right? And this is really, this is the human condition. This is what we do. This is what we are. And as we go forward in this series and we start to discuss how this moved forward into more complex social forms, because these were happening in very basic tribal cultures where, you maybe had a tribe of 70 or 80 people, very closely related, all knew each other very, very well, very intimate, very small, very, very protective sort of communities. That had to be scaled up dramatically to give us city-based life, and city-based life is civilization, right? That's where we're going with this. So we'll follow this thread a little bit more in the next one. I strongly advise you to find a copy of Bruce Chatwin's book. He wrote many good books, but the Songlines was terrific. It's really a good one. Well worth it. Anyway, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.